Jason, if you wouldn't mind hopping on so Emma can get back on.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center and our conversation today on how to best enhance our nation's energy innovation system to position America for economic leadership in the coming low-carbon energy transition. I'm Sasha Mackler, the director of BPC's Energy Project, and for more than a decade, the BPC and its project, the American Energy Innovation Council, have been working on the case that our national energy innovation system is central to maintaining America's global competitiveness and must be enhanced through a strong collaboration between the public and private sector to ensure a timely, cost-effective, and successful set of climate-friendly technology solutions are available to power our economy in the coming century. The AEIC brings together a set of corporate leaders, CEOs, and former executives of leading American companies who have joined with us to offer a framework for this agenda. Today, we're releasing a set of recommendations that can inform how to build this foundation for a more ambitious energy system. We have assembled a great panel of our principals from the AEIC to walk through these recommendations and discuss the implications and significance of these ideas. But before we turn to them and the discussion of our report, it's important to note the context in which we are entering this conversation. Right now, there is legislation in Congress that is poised to significantly bolster this agenda. The Energy Act of 2020 appears to be part of the end-of-year package that may be voted into law this week. It would be a major step forward, representing tireless work from our organization and many others, both on and off Capitol Hill. It's a bipartisan package that incorporates ideas from Republicans and Democrats, launching important new programs that will support critical technologies such as carbon capture, nuclear, energy storage, hydrogen, renewables, along with increased funding for ARPA-E and important new demonstration projects. We congratulate all of our friends and colleagues that have brought it this far and encourage its passage this week. We are also incredibly fortunate to have a leading member of Congress with us this morning to help us understand the implications of this legislation and what it suggests for the way forward on energy innovation and climate next year. Representative Lizzie Fletcher from the 7th Congressional District of Texas is here to speak with us. Congresswoman Fletcher represents the energy capital of the U.S., Houston, and serves on the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, as well as the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, where she chairs the Energy Subcommittee. She's one of the most thoughtful and energetic voices in Congress on these issues of innovation and energy. She's a co-sponsor of the Fossil Energy R&D Act, the ARPA-E reauthorization bill, among other noteworthy efforts. Congresswoman Fletcher was elected in 2018 and has already made an important mark on energy and climate, and we're really looking forward to hearing her thoughts today. We'll turn to her for some opening remarks, and then hopefully we can have some time for questions from the audience before we move to the discussion with the AEIC members on the report we're releasing today. So thanks for joining us today, Congresswoman Fletcher. Without further delay, I'd like to turn the floor over to you. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Sasha. I'm so glad to be with you. Thank you to AEIC for inviting me to participate. And I appreciated all the kind things you said in your introduction. I would just maybe correct one thing when you said my district in Houston represents the energy capital of the U.S. We believe that we represent the energy capital of the world, and it is a really important part of what I am doing and what we're doing in the Congress to make sure that the United States remains the leader in energy globally, and of course for me to make sure that Houston stays the capital of the energy capital of the world. So, but I am so glad to be with you all this morning. It's still morning here in Houston. I know we're gathered from all over, but to share just a few thoughts with you about these topics, about the importance of energy innovation and the need for bipartisan action on innovation and climate. There is no question more critical to our energy future than how we address the dual challenge of producing energy for the world while also reducing harmful emissions and battling climate change. And to do so, the two topics that you asked me to talk about are critical: energy innovation and bipartisan action. And since I arrived in Congress, as you said, I have worked to better understand the landscape, the issues, and the opportunities before us, and to build coalitions and to work across the aisle and with stakeholders from everywhere I can to bring people together around these issues, because we are facing real challenges in this moment. And we will continue to face them in the future. And they're ones that this Congress has been focused on addressing, and I know the next Congress will be committed to addressing as well. So, doing this work starts with having the input of a diverse and broad coalition of stakeholders who have the energy expertise that we need to chart our path forward. A lot of people are talking about the challenges. We need a lot of people talking about the answers and the solutions. And I think that it is essential that this work really centers on crafting ambitious but workable plans and depoliticizing this conversation. Our plans and our process moving forward have to be focused on working together, not casting blame or delaying action. And that's why I'm so glad that AEIC's leadership and vision in this moment is so important. That's why I'm glad that you've put out this paper and that you're doing this work to create the technology that we need now and in the future. Having the expertise and leadership of experienced industry leaders is critical to addressing the questions before us, not just what needs to be done or what can be done, but how can we do it? And importantly, how can we do it in a way that will succeed? How can we do it in a way that will last? And that's the challenge before policymakers. How we make policy that achieves these ends isn't seen as temporary, that isn't the target or the rallying cry to change everything every 2 or 4 years. That won't get us where we need to be. It won't help us achieve our climate goals. It won't help us achieve our energy goals. And so, to me, from my experience, both in Congress and before, the best way to do that is to build consensus and to build bipartisan consensus. And in addition to that, you have to build that consensus by beginning with real understanding. So to me, that's where you all come in. Those of you who've heard me speak before know that I will ask you to engage with members of Congress and leaders on both sides of the aisle. And that's because it's really important to educate and inform. It doesn't mean having all of the answers. It just means having useful expertise and conveying your willing partnership to find those answers and to find the answers together. And as I've said before, to me, the best way to make sure that everyone is heard and everyone is included in the process, and to make sure that we find a consensus about this path forward. So I'm sort of speaking to you this morning from a political space where that can be a challenge, but it is possible. And I was just telling my constituents on a telephone town hall last night that of the votes I took in this Congress, the 116th Congress, more than 80% of them had broad bipartisan support. more than 2/3 of the members of the House were voting in support of that legislation. And so it is possible. It's not what we see every night on the news. And certainly there are strong and challenging divisions, but it is possible. So the question is, how do we do that around energy issues politically? And I think, to meet this dual challenge, we need the United States leading the way to an energy future that is cleaner, safer, and more efficient. So 2050 will look very different from today. But to get there, to achieve our goals, it's going to require forward-looking, inclusive, and informed policy that will make a meaningful difference in charting our course forward. In the last decade, the advances in technology that have transformed our energy economy have substantially reduced U.S. carbon emissions already. I talk a lot to my colleagues about what's happened by replacing coal-fired power plants with natural gas plants, contributing more to the reduction of domestic carbon emissions than any other effort. And obviously, reducing emissions is the key to addressing climate change. And those are the kinds of things we didn't necessarily know 10 years ago. So we're looking ahead to 2050. We don't know everything that we're going to see, but we do know that we need creative thinking. We need people who understand how we do things today and what the opportunities are before us. And, looking back, looking around right now, and looking forward requires both expertise and imagination. And members of Congress need both of those things too. And so I think that's where you play such an important role. Now, I know you wanted me to talk a little bit about some of what we have done in this Congress and what we see happening going forward. So I'll mention just very briefly, as a member of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, I chair the Subcommittee on Energy, and I serve on the Subcommittee on the Environment. And we've been focused on addressing the need for clean, reliable energy at home and around the world, the reality and urgency of climate change, and the concerns for our environment and our communities. And on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where I also sit, we focused on this question of how do we develop a modern energy infrastructure that both lowers carbon emissions and delivers low-cost energy to consumers that allows our economy to thrive, the very issues you raised starting off this meeting. These efforts exist on every committee in the Congress, and the 117th Congress will expand on that work, guided in part by the work of the Select Committee on Climate Change in this Congress. And what I have seen are real areas of opportunity and, yes, bipartisan consensus. So let me talk a little bit about what some of those are and the legislative priorities for this Congress as we close out the year and looking ahead to next Congress. As you mentioned, over the summer, the House passed an energy package focused on how we can make serious federal investments to develop critical energy technologies that we will rely on in our energy mix for the next century. We are hopeful that several of the provisions outlined in this bill will be included in this omnibus spending package that we're working on right now and that we'll be voting on in the coming days. It includes legislation I was proud to work on, the BEST Act, the Better Energy Storage Technology Act, which reauthorizes the DOE's grid scale storage research to facilitate breakthroughs for the 21st century electrical grid. As we continue to see more renewables added to portfolios across the country, developing modern storage infrastructure to support it will be key to reducing emissions. I am also hopeful that the year-end package will see the Fossil Energy Research and Development Act that you mentioned earlier as well. This bill, which I helped lead with my friend from Fort Worth, Congressman Mark Vesey and others, invests in the research and development of large-scale demonstration of carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology. We are also hopeful to see the ARPA-E provisions and the reauthorization in this bill as well. And so I'm really optimistic that some of your priorities are in fact already reflected in the work of the 116th Congress. Our work on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is also reflected in the Moving Forward bill that we passed this summer as well. And while we don't expect that to pass in this Congress, I think the framework will be a driver, no pun intended, for the infrastructure package in the next Congress. And that's an area that the incoming Biden administration has prioritized. So many of the carbon reduction initiatives and so much of the technology innovation needed there will be included in our work going forward. That said, for those interested, I am also hopeful that we will finalize the PHMSA reauthorization this year. That's an issue I've worked on extensively throughout this Congress, and I am hopeful that that will be in this package as well. And I'm proud to have helped move these critical priorities through this Congress, making sure that the federal government puts the investment and support around giving energy leaders the tools to transform our infrastructure, to develop technology, and really to build our energy future. And of course, there's much, much more work we can do, and I look forward to doing that in the next Congress. Implementing transformative transportation and infrastructure projects is an opportunity not only to focus on our relief from this pandemic, creating jobs to spur the economy, but also to build in a way where we develop a modern energy infrastructure that both lowers carbon emissions and delivers low-cost energy to consumers that allows the economy to thrive. On the science, space, and technology, for the next Congress, we will consider legislation related to the Department of Energy Office of Science, Vehicles, Bioengineering, Hydrogen fuel cells, and Building Technologies. Another opportunity for the next Congress is taking a holistic look at energy tax policy, which didn't garner as much attention during this Congress, but I think will be critical to spurring innovation. This Congress, I introduced the Recoups Act to help businesses take advantage of the 45Q tax credit and incentivize CCUS technology development. And I would really like to see that move forward. Another bipartisan bill I introduced, the Alternative Fuel Tax Credit Extension Act of 2019, that revives a lapsed federal tax credit to incentivize the use of natural gas. Got a one-year extension signed into law, but we're pushing for this credit to be extended more. And those are just a couple of the kinds of things that are on my agenda and on the agenda for the 117th Congress. There's certainly more concrete steps we can and will take to build and plan for our energy future. But at the heart of this conversation, at the heart of these policy matters, is really making sure that energy leaders like y'all with experience and expertise, whether it's from my district, from across the country, it's critical to make sure that you are participating and have a voice at the table. Our country leads in energy production and innovation because of the work that you do. And my job is to bring that perspective back to Washington, to have a collaborative, informed, effective, and dare I say, bipartisan plan for our future. So I'm glad to share a little bit of that perspective to start off this morning, and I'm happy to answer a few questions before you begin your panel discussion. So thanks again for having me. I'm so glad to be with you.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Congresswoman. Really interesting remarks. Maybe we can just take a couple of questions from the audience before I know you have to move on to other things. And we do have one from Thomas Green, who is wondering what you think of CCS technologies and how they can help companies in Houston meet their climate goals.
Well, I think it's really exciting. I think we've seen really promising technologies, and a lot of this research is happening here in Houston, in the 7th Congressional District in particular. And what we've seen are really the challenges of not having the guidance from the IRS, which is why I worked very hard to get some of the guidance issued during this Congress so that people could move forward and understand and plan. And that's a theme I hear consistently from folks in every sector of our lives. Really knowing the landscape and being able to plan is critical. And so I will keep pushing to make sure that we have the guidance and that we have the tools that we need. But I think CCUS has great potential, both in terms of the uses we already have, EOR, but also in terms of additional technologies. There are a lot of people interested in direct air capture, and certainly there's a corollary here where we can work to do that, and that would be a game changer. And so while some people are skeptical, and I've definitely met some skeptics in Congress who are skeptical about CCUS, I really think it is important that we put our energy behind this. That's why I sponsored the Fossil Energy R&D Act. It's why I've worked so hard to get it passed, because I think that this is the kind of game-changing technology that we should be investing in at the national scale. We should be putting the efforts of the DOE and our labs and our research behind it to help make it possible, because that is so transformative that we have to be able to do everything we can to bring those projects forward. And I think, we've got some tools, but what we see now is that we need a level of government investment and support that I think is ready. I think it's out there. Again, this is a place where there's bipartisan consensus And I think that that is a really important part of the path forward. So I am optimistic that it will help address our challenges. I also think it's really important for folks here in Houston. And I will just add, in case I don't get another question on the Houston angle, so much of what we saw in our energy package that we passed this fall, Houston stands to benefit. And there's so much technology that happens here. People don't think of Houston as a hub of technology, but if you think about it, it is in the energy space. And there's so much technology that happens here where we are really leading the country and the world. And so I think that we are well poised to take advantage of some of the grant programs and other incentives that we put together in this energy package. And so I'm excited to see them get authorized, at least some of them get authorized now, and to continue to work on these kinds of programs. And I think they will be a great benefit to Houston and, of course, in turn, to everyone across the country and around the world because of the work that we do here. So I'm excited to see that and to help make that happen.
Well, that's great. Thanks. Yes, and we are all counting on the companies in Houston to really help bring forward the technologies we're going to need to deal with these challenges. That's for sure. Maybe one final question before we let you go, and that is from Michael Yancey, who was wondering, I'll just shorten the question a bit. What's your view on permitting reforms? Because that does seem to be a major challenge to building things quickly. And we know that the climate challenge is one that requires not only scale, but speed. And so what's your view on how we can try to address some of those challenges?
Well, I think it is essential that we continue to build these projects. One of the things I talk about a lot in the infrastructure committee is how important it is that we invest in our infrastructure. And when it comes to a lot of the infrastructure for energy, of course, there are national investments and things like modernizing our grid, which we are working on and certainly have advanced legislation for that. But a lot of the energy infrastructure is privately owned, and the permitting process is very long and detailed. And I think that there are opportunities to streamline that and to ensure that everybody's being heard. And look, we've seen the challenges during this pandemic of making sure we have community input and community involvement. But again, as I said earlier, there's a real concern about being able to plan. And so one of the areas where I think we can do a lot of good is bringing people together to talk about the challenges that we see in permitting. What are the objections? What are the concerns? We actually addressed some of this in our energy bill as well, because there were some real concerns about permitting. And being in Congress, I have the opportunity to talk to my colleagues about what are your constituents' concerns and how can we address them together on the front end so that we have a process that works for everyone, for the folks who are trying to obtain the permits, for the folks who are doing the reviews, and for the people who have concerns that want to be heard. And I do think that there have been a lot of conversations in this Congress, and I'm very much looking forward to continuing those conversations because it is important that we have reliable infrastructure. And we know that part of that is making sure that these new projects to rebuild our aging infrastructure are able to move forward. And I do talk about that a lot, that, we have 2.5 million miles of pipelines, which is in this country, which are largely unseen infrastructure. They're buried. People don't know that they're there. But as we talk about our aging roads and bridges, we have aging pipelines too. And so, we want to make sure that to protect our environment, we're able to do things like improve the technology. That's another place where I spent a lot of time and was very, very pleased to be able to get past an amendment in the PHMSA reauthorization to facilitate new technologies for pipeline inspection. That's critical. We want to make sure that our pipelines are safe. And the best way we can do that is by having the most up-to-date technology to ensure that. And so that's a place where I think that there's a lot of bipartisan agreement. There's a lot of opportunity to work together. But we have to understand the challenges in front of us. And we have to have a national conversation that brings everybody in and gets everybody on the same page about how we move forward. And I really do see that from where I sit as the opportunity and the responsibility of the Congress. And I'm very glad to be able to do that from my committee work and also through the work that I'm doing with you all and with others to share this message and to really work together. Like I've said, I think the challenges are too great for us to do anything other then find bipartisan consensus to depoliticize this conversation about energy, to invest in new energy technologies and make it possible, and really to make sure that all of us are at the table and working together for the good of everyone. So again, thank you so much for allowing me to share those thoughts with you this morning. I'm so glad to be with you and really excited to continue working together. I know I have some constituents on this call, so I just want to say hello to them as well. And thank you for all the work you're doing. I look forward to hearing from you and working with you now and into the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for your leadership and thanks for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Glad to be with you.
Great. And moving on in our agenda, I'd like to hand things off to my colleague Addison Stark, who leads the innovation program at the BPC, and he'll be saying a bit about the new recommendations that are being released today and then moderating a panel with our AEIC members. So I'll turn things over to Addison now.
That's right. Thanks, Sasha. And exactly as Sasha had mentioned this morning, the American Energy Innovation Council released a new report with 5 key recommendations that I'm going to walk through now. As part of what we're aiming to do is set up through innovation the development of the technologies we need to decarbonize the U.S. Energy economy and economy broadly, and this is what we intend to do. So first, we recommend, the first key recommendation is to triple the federal funding for clean energy innovation to $25 billion per year over the next 5 years. So this is an ambitious goal that other groups, for example, Columbia University and ITIF, give a roadmap here of how this could be spent. And we echo the community in saying that this has been a critical component of what we need to do to develop the technology we need, and has been a message of the AEIC for the past decade. Second, we recommend expanding funding for RPE to $1 billion per year. RPE is proven to be a very successful program in the Department of Energy, showing that through the creation of new companies, through the success of driving follow-on funding in the private sector, that we can really drive the creative entrepreneurial activity in this space to bring the technologies to scale. Third, we need a new energy challenge program, a focus on demonstration and overcoming the demonstration gap by supporting building large-scale pilot projects. So moving past what we see RPE being able to fund, how do we think about that next big, even more expensive gap? And finally, we look to 2 other recommendations to help align these first 3 strategies. Number 1 is to create, or our fourth recommendation is to create an independent national energy strategy board to help align our goals, to bring in external experts to understand and bring in these views that allow us to focus our energy innovation spending. And lastly is to continue to expand centers of excellence with strong domain expertise to support the entrepreneurial ecosystem in energy innovation, and to better support growing American companies and American jobs focused on these technologies. And so now I'm excited to turn to our panel of our American Energy Innovation Council principals. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Norm Augustine, who is a founding member of the American Energy Innovation Council. He's the former chairman and CEO of Lockheed Martin and a former undersecretary of the Army. Chad Holliday is also a founding member of the AEIC. He currently serves as chairman of Royal Dutch Shell and was formerly CEO of DuPont. Mike Graff is the chairman and CEO of American Air Liquide Holdings and the executive vice president of the Americas and Asia for Air Liquide Group. And Geisha Williams was most recently the CEO and president of PG&E Corporation and currently serves as a board member of Siemens Energy. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for all of your work on this important topic. So I'm going to turn to you, Norm and Chad. You've been with AEIC since its formation, and you know the importance of investment in energy innovation and importance of the message we're bringing today. I want to turn to you and ask, we have this ambition how do we actualize? How do we move forward and start to drive this message? We heard a great reflection from Congresswoman Fletcher to this point earlier.
Chad, do you want to?
Yeah, Norm, thank you very much. I guess we're the two original founding members that are on the call today. So we have great confidence in what this will turn out to be. I just say this work, our recommendations really haven't fundamentally changed in the 10 years we've been in business. And we've seen some good progress in places. ARPA-E has really paid off in very significant ways. And what we see is what's being proposed in the energy bill that's coming up this week and what's in this proposal we think is essential to get there. If I could just add, by coincidence, a Shell published earlier this week a net zero by 2050 plan for the U.S. economy from an energy system standpoint. And when you look at those recommendations around hydrogen and biomass and carbon capture and storage, we need this proposals from the AEIC to make that happen. Otherwise, they'll just be a wishful thinking. So hopefully we're moving in the right direction. Norm.
Okay, thanks, Chad. Looking back about a decade ago when we put together the AEIC, the situation was quite different from where we are today. If you take a perspective of the severity of the issues we face in climate change, there was much less recognition of that severity at the time. Today, we've now passed 400 parts per million in terms of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's more than any time in the last 900,000 years by a substantial amount. It's almost the rise has almost all been since the beginning of the industrialized age. And there was a great deal of skepticism when we started as to whether there was really a problem. Today, I think there are very few people question whether or not there is a serious problem to be dealt with in climate change. And we have a long way to go. Even today, about 88% of the world's energy consumption or use still comes from fossil fuels. And that's a number that's declined by about 1% in the last quarter of a century. And when one looks at just the changes that we see in our lifetimes, in terms of climate, we have fires, floods, and so on. And I don't want to build a case on a short database, but the evidence over the years, I think, has been very compelling. And so to your question, what do we do about it? We've offered these recommendations that should make a significant difference. The energy bill that's before the Congress now is, if passed, will be a great step forward. But there's still, I think, the task we have of convincing the public of the importance of government involvement in these activities. And that's probably another topic to talk about. But it's easy to say 90% of the energy enterprise in this country is owned by the private sector. So why didn't the private sector go solve the problem? They make the profits. And that's a question worthy of a lot of consideration, but I'll turn back to you for now.
Thanks, Norm. And, you're right that, there's a big challenge in front of us. And it's important that, as more and more people are recognizing it's not just the energy sector, it's the industrial sector, it's transportation, it's the economy writ large. And that's why I'm excited the fact that our panel has representation from the power sector and industrial and looking at transportation. And so, Mike, I'll turn to you. We think about these broader challenges beyond just electricity, and your company is focused on, thinking about industrial gases and in particular hydrogen. I'd turn to you to understand a little bit more. What are the key challenges in bringing a new platform technology like that? What are the innovation challenges you're working on right now in hydrogen, and where do you see some of the impactful places for that technology?
Thanks, Addison, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. And I'd especially like to thank Congresswoman Fletcher for her comments, more importantly, her leadership on these important subjects. For Air Liquide and thinking about how we approach all of this, I mean, obviously it starts with our own assets, and we have our own plans in place, and we're well along and well advanced on our own climate objectives in that regard. But it goes beyond that. It has to do with how we enable our customers to lower their carbon footprint, and then how do we enable an ecosystem that allows the world around us to go ahead and fully utilize energy, fully utilize all that they need to do in a low carbon world. And we think hydrogen is a critical component of that. We've been involved in hydrogen for over 50 years. And it started certainly with R&D and new technology and new innovations that we continue to work on and develop today. And the development of all this is really something that is, first of all, important to the world. There's actually a lot of projections that would suggest that within 30 years, that hydrogen in itself could be about 20% of the entire energy supply requirements needs as supplied for the entire world. And so that would actually abate 6.5 gigatons of carbon. Roughly 20% of all the carbon that's generated from every source on the planet today would be abated. And so we see that as critically important. So we've taken those innovations, and first we had to demonstrate those at scale. And so our challenge right now is doing exactly that. And we are in the middle of starting facilities up here in the US and in North America, as well as the rest of the world. And literally, as we speak today, we are starting up the world's first at-scale PEM electrolyzer, basically utilizing power from Hoover Dam to go ahead and produce hydrogen, liquefy it, and will actually seed the development of the transportation industry in the northeastern part of the US. Similarly, we are taking these same concepts and utilizing renewable sources of energy, basically taking landfill off gas and converting that into a synthetic natural gas with our own membrane technologies, and then reforming that and liquefying that with renewable power that will actually provide all of the needs of clean hydrogen for the state of California as the new zero emission vehicles driven by a hydrogen fuel cell will be introduced next year. So we see ourselves needing to go ahead and demonstrate this at scale. It's clearly going to take that kind of capability. It's going to take that type of infrastructure, and it's going to take an ecosystem of all of us working together. And in order to accomplish that, it's not just Air Liquide. What we tried to do about 4 years ago, we created something called the Hydrogen Council. And we had about 6 like-minded companies that got together across different sectors of industry around the world to go ahead and recognize hydrogen as an opportunity. Today, there's over 92 companies, some of those represented on the panel today, and we are clearly driving the concepts of innovation, R&D, but at scale development and proposing infrastructure around the world to make this a reality.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, exactly. Following on from what you're saying there, some of the key challenges are bridging that demonstration gap in those early deployments. And I'd turn to you, Geisha. You've seen this challenge from different angles. As utility exec and now as on the board of a company developing and manufacturing energy technologies, can you talk a bit about some of these challenges you see in bringing innovation from the lab to the field? And how can we better connect innovation investments with clean tech deployment?
Yes, certainly. And it really is a challenge. If you go from, as you mentioned earlier in your comments, from research to prototype to demonstration, it takes tremendous resolve, tremendous leadership, and tremendous resources. And I would tell you that no one company has the wherewithal to make it happen. It requires very strong private and public partnership. And frankly, it's going to require the type of funding that only the federal government can provide. I, as you know, serve on the Siemens Energy Board. I'm on the Innovation and Finance Committee. And our focus is not just about today, but what are we going to do into the future? And working with the various governments around the world, that we believe this is a global issue. But the United States has historically played such a leadership position, both in energy and innovation. And we need to continue to have that place in our global energy space. So from my point of view, it's interesting to see it from the Siemens perspective, the amount of research that's being done today, whether it's on hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, continued focus on making renewables more cost effective, continued focus on energy storage. It's incredible what's being done there, but not one company, not one country can make it happen. It's going to require tremendous collaboration to take it from the lab to pilots, to broad demonstration projects, to at-scale market. And as I said, it's really a question of resolve, of leadership, and ultimately resources to make that sort of dream a reality.
Okay, so that's really a great point. And you're right that it's not just any one company. I think that's important, and it leads to a lot of the conversations and questions we've asked as the AEIC. And I'd turn back to Norm here and thinking about how do we overcome these challenges of coordinating technology demonstrations. I know you've seen this from the DoD side, and we've been trying to take some lessons from that to feed into our AEIC work. But I'd wonder your thoughts about ways we can have the public sector help support this work.
Well, it's a critical issue. I think I would start out by saying that, particularly in the energy arena, taking an idea and putting it in the field as an operating, financially viable entity is quite different from many other, maybe even most other fields. We hear a lot about the valley of death in electronics and the likes. And how do you get an idea from the laboratory into a working prototype? Well, in the energy world, having a working prototype is a long way from having an operation in the field that's financially viable and that works effectively. And it's that second step that I think we need to focus on with regard to your question. ARPA-E does a fabulous job of dealing with that first valley of death. That second valley of death in the energy arena, where, as you've heard, no one company can afford by itself to take an idea through that second valley. And that's where cooperation with the government, the private sector and the government becomes so important. And that's something that has not always come easily. In this case, I think the council has made suggestions along these lines that what is needed is an independent organization that can not only do some planning. Sadly, our government really doesn't have a plan in the energy arena, nor has it had one for a long time. We don't even have a capital budget for anything in our federal budget. I know of no successful company that doesn't have a capital budget. So here's a place where the government can step in and help with planning, can help with funding, and also can play an important role in creating a political environment where such undertakings are acceptable to the public. And I say that because there will be failures. We're talking about research and development, and in that world, my background is principally in aerospace, and not every rocket works. I'll guarantee you that. And I'm afraid that's true in the energy arena as well. But in both cases, the stakes are large and the costs are big. And cooperation with the government and the private sector is probably more important in this arena than most others you could think of.
Yeah, thanks, Norman. I'm just going to quickly remind everyone to please submit questions using the live chat on YouTube or Facebook, or on Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive. I know we've been seeing some questions come in, and we appreciate that engagement. So, Chad, I want to turn to you again, because one of the key things that we recognize as part of these investments is we're not just talking about decarbonizing and attacking climate change, but we're also talking about economic growth and national competitiveness. And one of the things that we've seen is, while we have had ambitious goals coming out of the AEIC, we have not seen fully the amount of money we should be investing as we ultimately want to see. How do we think more about positioning ourselves internationally?
Well, I think we should build on our strengths. It's a great question you ask. And if I could go back to what Norm was talking about, this energy strategy board, which is the recommendations, is very important, because I think we will get to these valleys and won't get across them fast enough. So that is a given. Some process like that in Congress, I wish you'd take a close look at that particular recommendation, because I think it'll be necessary, because this is a very different kind of development than electronics development. But I think the other proposal we have around these centers of excellence, this is where the U.S. can win. So Shell, we have labs around the world, but Congresswoman, in your district in Houston is where we're focused on our hydrogen research, because we found the best capability there. So we could build on that and build on everything Mike was talking about, of how important hydrogen could be in the difference and what a difference it can make in this country in the next 20 or 30 years. And so I think we have to pull together those focus areas. If we try to focus on everything, it'll be too much. But I think hydrogen is certainly one of the candidates for that. And I believe that carbon capture and storage is a second candidate for that. We should be very, very good at it as we move forward. If I could take us all back many decades to a movie called The Graduate that perhaps you've seen. And when The Graduate came out, someone whispered in his ear, plastics. And I was in that era. And so I spent a career in plastics. I think the word I would whisper in his ear now would be hydrogen. And I believe you'd be serving him quite well. So let's just keep whispering that word every time we have a chance. And I know Mike's going to do that.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, we do have a couple of, it's central, right? And thinking about industrial gases and the things we're thinking about on the broader industrial decarbonization, it also brings to that other point that you're saying, Chad, is CCS is going to be central, not just for industrial, but power and everything else. And so I'd turn back to Mike again. How are you thinking about CO2, which has traditionally been a waste gas? Are you looking at it towards valorization? How do you think about it as another revenue stream?
So for us today, it actually already is a revenue stream in many respects. I mean, you have the utilization of CO2 in a variety of different industries to produce various products, whether that's foods, whether that's electronics, whether that's even energy with tertiary oil recovery and those types of things. And I could go on, but it's already well used today around the world. I think the key is going to be in the future, first of all, to fully develop and demonstrate at scale those technologies to capture carbon. We as a company have already developed some of those technologies and have actually begun to deploy them in different parts of the world today. For example, the traditional means to produce hydrogen is by reforming methane with steam and producing hydrogen. And that generates carbon both in terms of the combustion process to heat the process, as well as in the process itself. And we actually have the technologies today to capture 90 to 98% of all of that carbon. And the important piece of this is that not only can we capture that, but the technologies allow us to actually produce that carbon dioxide, in an already supercritical state. So it's already liquefied. So now it's easy to transport, and it's easy to go ahead and sequester and or to use in some other means. And this really becomes important because if you think about enabling a low carbon industry structure for the future, there are a number of industries, and we're already working with many of them. Chad mentioned plastics and chemicals, a very key area for the world around us and products that we clearly need in the world around us to go ahead and thrive in almost everything we want to do, whether that's lightweighting vehicles, whether that's electric vehicles, whether that's healthcare and packaging and food and pharma. Everything is actually utilizing those types of materials. So how can you produce those in a lower carbon way? And there's a lot of research going on right now as to how you can combine hydrogen with CO2 and get to some of those feedstocks. Similarly, in the steel industry, how do you back out the carbon, some of that carbon anyway, that goes into a blast furnace, and replace that with hydrogen and begin that kind of a process? And we're already doing that. And even in terms of utilizing oxygen or an oxy-combustion process to displace air, reduce the amount of CO2 you produce, as well as NOx and a variety of other things. So I think there's many aspects of how industrial gases are a core component of this. We were very active. I sit on the National Petroleum Council. I'm a member of the executive committee there as well. And we put forward a number of recommendations on CO2 last year as to how to enable its capture, how to enable its use. And I think you'll continue to see many industries looking at how we do that.
That's very interesting. And like we were talking about, centrality to this whole thing is still many, and a lot of predictions and models say that electricity is going to grow. The production of clean electricity, the utilization and the centrality of electricity to decarbonize futures is going to be an important component of this. I'll turn back to you, Geisha. Thinking about a question that was asked to Representative Fletcher earlier, how do we think about building out the infrastructure we need? It's not just electric, but it's pipelines and everything. But how do we go back and, from your lens, think about how we build fast?
Well, I think the electric industry has done a terrific job of decarbonizing, whether it's through renewable or the nuclear portfolio. The amount of emissions that have been reduced on the electric sector are truly remarkable, and I'm very proud of the progress that's been made. That's step one. In order to electrify and be able to electrify in a clean manner, that energy supply had to be cleaner. But now it's time to look at broader. We need to look at the energy economy. And as you look at transportation and the industrials, there's a real opportunity to take electric processes and supplant some of the more carbon intensive industries that are out there. And I guess transportation really comes to mind. In my home state of California, more than 40% of the emissions that are in the air today, carbon emissions, come from the tailpipe. So there's a real opportunity to take electricity and really transform the transportation sector into one that's cleaner and less emission heavy. I think there's opportunities to do that in shipping, and I think there's opportunities to do that in long range trucking, particularly if you start thinking about hydrogen as a fuel that can be used there. So I think you've got to look at this as bigger than just any one industry or any one company. You've got to look at where are the sources of carbon coming from, and how do you come up with strategies using clean electricity to really go after that. I think we've made progress, but clearly a lot more work needs to be done. I think renewables have clearly shown that they're now able to compete with the fossil fuels. We're seeing huge improvements in storage, but the next big nut to crack, I really do think, is hydrogen. I think hydrogen very much is the future, and we've got to think about how do we take hydrogen and incorporate it into our natural gas burning generation. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. You could start introducing hydrogen into some of the generation assets, and we don't know what that limit is, but certainly it could be very important in decarbonizing. So we think electricity is very much a part of the future, and making sure that that electricity generation is as clean as possible is something that I know that the electric industry is really focused on.
Really interesting to see that we've arrived at a technology consensus here. And I think that recognizing that there's some very importance of decarbonized energy vectors in center of all of this. And so I'm excited now to turn to our Chad, you have another thought before I turn to the audience?
Well, look, I just wanted to kind of wrap up this conversation on hydrogen a bit. A country is going to lead this. We have all the tools for it to be us. If it's not us, it's going to be China. And so there is a real sense of urgency in the bill that might pass here in the next few days, or the steps we take in the future to get private industry and the government to get together, because we don't want to miss this window. We've missed a few recently, and we don't want that to happen again. So there's a real sense of urgency to focus on this one, plus some others that we go forward. I just got to stress that importance.
Yeah, Mike.
And if I might, I'd like to just slip in a thought here too. Clearly, electricity is of enormous importance. Hydrogen is very promising. We often overlook fusion power, which to me will be the answer in the long term. And even fission power, we can do a great deal more with than we are today. And unfortunately, they have a bad name because they have the word nuclear associated with them, but that doesn't necessarily mean they can't be made safe. Fusion can be very safe. And today we're investing 0.03% of the GDP on clean energy research. And fusion is probably maybe 1/100 of that. For a problem of the magnitude we're dealing with, I'd just like to lay the thought out that 0.03% doesn't seem like an adequate investment from the federal budget.
I think that's right, Norman. I'll turn to you, Mike, for one last thought before I turn to audience questions.
Sure. Thanks, Addison. I wanted to build on what Chad said in terms of innovation and creativity. I mean, it's been the driver of the U.S. Since we became a country. And we want to continue to utilize that. We want to continue to embellish that. And I think public-private partnerships, ARPA-E, a variety of things that you have just talked about in your presentation help enable that for the future. And something like hydrogen is a pure example of that, to Chad's point, and also to Geisha's point on renewable power. I think long-term for the world, and certainly for the U.S., one of the critical components here is the production of renewable power and its full use, its full utilization in every sector where it makes sense. And one of our challenges is when you think about power from the sun with photovoltaics, or you think about wind-generated power, the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun goes down at night. So how do we build an ecosystem that will allow you to fully utilize those sources of renewable power and make sure you can store that energy in some way so you can use it at night to power the city of Washington or New York or Houston or Paris or wherever, or when the wind stops blowing, or when you have a peak power need. And I really think hydrogen becomes a core answer to this. And we are already demonstrating the U.S. is furthest ahead on this than any other country. If I just take the state of Texas as an ecosystem in itself, we are generating enormous amounts of wind power up in the Panhandle. We are already contracting to move some of that power into our own industrial systems down in the Gulf Coast. And we're already utilizing it into our systems that run 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So we know how to build that ecosystem. But the big piece of this is if I can take excess power, renewable power, and I can generate hydrogen and I can store it, then I have what I need. And we already have the world's largest hydrogen storage systems here in the state of Texas, here in the US. So I think we can demonstrate how to do this. I think we can make it a clear reality, and we can be at the forefront of this. And to Chad's point, all of Europe is already investing in this. All of the countries are putting tens of billions of dollars into this. And I'll tell you right now, in Asia, while certainly Japan has been helping to drive this, we see an enormous effort that has begun to evolve in both South Korea and China. And for them, it's not just about climate, it's not just about sustainability. They do not have natural indigenous sources of power to meet all their needs. And this is the perfect mix for them. They can generate the power with hydrogen, and they can utilize it in transportation, industry, and even heating for homes.
Thanks, Mike. So turning to audience questions now, we do have a great one that I think touches on the question of momentum. So Brady Noel asked, what steps are most critical in continuing to build the momentum and progress we've made in decarbonization initiatives, both in the private sector, in the corporate arena, but also in the political sector?
Well, if I could, maybe I'll start, and I'm sure others have some thoughts as well. I mean, we've talked a lot about technology and innovation. Clearly, in order to make this work, you not only have to capture carbon and you have to go ahead and then do something with it, you need the infrastructure to do those types of things. And so I think for the capture piece, there's obviously a cost to capturing carbon. And so how do we incentivize that in the right way? How do we create an incentive mechanism so that various companies will begin to capture that carbon and then find a way to transport that with the right infrastructure to make that work? And I think the infrastructure issue for the country is already there. It's already a discussion in Congress. We talk about not just rebuilding the infrastructure that was designed and built in the 20th century, but how do we design and build the infrastructure that make us the envy of the world and continue to drive the innovation mindset we need in the world around us here in the US. That's power generation and transmission. That's clearly hydrogen, as I spoke about before. It's probably infrastructure for carbon. It's 5G. It's a variety of other things. And in the end, it takes the public-private partnerships to do that. It's going to also take climate-friendly policy and legislation to help drive it.
Another question came in that I think follows onto this, and it goes back to some of Chad's comments from before, was from Elliot Roseman. The greatest increases in greenhouse gas emissions are going to occur in developing countries. So how do we translate what's happening here in the US and American leadership to places where greenhouse gas emissions are going to be most prominent in the future?
Well, that's a great question. If I could jump in on that, I had the honor of chairing the UN process, Sustainable Energy for All, and that's very much what we were putting in place. Is how do we make sure that the technology developed in all the developing countries is used in Africa and other places that we need it. And when you talk to people in those countries, though, they don't want to wait to get energy because a billion of them don't have electricity as we know it today. So we've got to bring these processes along and use them in those countries in effective ways as we move. And I think as you summarize, all we're talking about here, either in developing countries or what we've been describing, if you would allow me to go to a great philosopher from my home state of Tennessee, Elvis Presley. We don't have a lot of great philosophers, so that's where we start. But he had a song, a little less talk, a little more action, please. And I think that's exactly what we need. We've been talking about this for decades. We have a window right now that the COVID vaccine is an example of what we can do if we put our minds to it. And can we use that example to really move on the most pressing issue facing the world and facing our country? And somehow we need to get together and make that happen.
Well, I think that's a note that is worthy of ending on. So I want to thank all of you for taking the time today to join us, to have this important conversation, and to really bring the message of innovation for solving our climate, economic, and broader development goals. So thank you, Mike, Chad, Geisha, and Norm for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Happy holidays.